StudyIQ INS अब तैयारी हुई अफोर्डेबल।
It is one of the most favorable maritime geographies of the world. Perhaps एक ही और देश है जिसका maritime geography भारत से बेहतर है और वो है United States of America. Because of our sea blindness, India got colonized.
We are always talking about the Third World War happening in the ocean, South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean being such a geopolitical turmoil right now, with the Red Sea in a crisis, and everybody's trying to have their own bases. Somewhere India is not building its naval power at a faster pace than it should. So is it a lack of strategic foresightedness, or is it something?
I would say it's a lack of political appreciation. Indian ports, if you look at them, India does not figure in the top 20 ports of the world.
Sag Policy में growth of all in the region ठीक है, security of all in the region is seen very suspiciously.
चीन का जो भूगोल है, चीन का जो पॉलिटिक्स है, वो बहुत ही उनके लिए नकारात्मक है. It's a very negative geography. They gave them hum and tota. हालांकि वो इतना सक्सेस तो नहीं रहा है.
Research ship or spy ship? हेलो एंड नमस्ते, मेरा नाम है डॉक्टर दीपानेता और आपका स्वागत है जियोपॉलिटिकल डायलॉग्स बाय StudyIQ. आज हमारे साथ है कमोडोर सी इधर भास्कर सर. भास्कर सर इज कंसिडर्ड टू बी वन ऑफ द बेस्ट स्ट्रैटेजिशियंस ऑफ इंडिया, एंड आप सभी ने इनका आर्टिकल तो पढ़ा ही होगा. वन ऑफ द मोस्ट प्रोलिफिक राइटर्स ऑन जियोपॉलिटिक्स. He has served in the Indian Navy for more than 35 years, sir?
Yeah, 37.
37 years. And he's also one of the very few people who have been the director of 3 Indian think tanks. One is the Manohar Parrikar IDSA and National Maritime Foundation, and right now the Society for Policy Studies. So first of all, sir, welcome to StudyIQ.
Thank you very much for calling me.
And we are going to talk today about Indian Ocean and the geopolitics revolving this region, India's maritime strategy, and so on and so forth, sir. So, sir, the first question is that because of our constant strategic thought process and our obsession with Pakistan and China, we have always focused on the continental strategies. Kahin na kahin, we have forgotten the maritime strategy, and because of which the Indian Navy has also been ignored. Do you think that has changed, or it's continuing to be that from the previous, historical time?
Well, I think first of all, this observation is very valid, that historically India has been sea blind. That's a term that we often use when we talk about India. And this is related to strategic culture of a country, its elite leadership, and a society. Very broadly, these are the 3 kind of constituencies. And when we talk of maritime empathy, some countries, some societies, some leaderships have exuded what you might call as a maritime empathy and a maritime competence. यानी कि कहीं ना कहीं उनके दिमाग में, उनकी सामरिक संस्कृति में समुंदर का जितने भी पॉसिबिलिटीज़ हैं, जितने भी अपॉर्चुनिटीज़ हैं, जो भी विकल्प हैं, उसका एक प्रकार का समझ भी है, एक प्रकार का पकड़ भी है, और उस क्षेत्र में उन्होंने अपने आप को प्रसिद्ध किया है. एंड द कॉन्ट्रास्ट इज विद इंडिया, दैट इज़ वी हैव अ वेरी फेवरेबल मैरिटाइम जोग्राफी. अगर आप कल्पना कर सकते हैं, भारत का जो पेनिनसुला है और हिंद महासागर में जिस प्रकार से भारत की जो पोजीशन है, geographical position, it is one of the most favorable maritime geographies of the world. Perhaps एक ही और देश है जिसका maritime geography भारत से बेहतर है, और वो है United States of America. Because as you know, when we talk about the maritime domain, there are only 3 navigable oceans in the world. The Pacific Ocean, which is the largest ocean of the world, then you have the Atlantic Ocean, and then you have the Indian Ocean. पर क्योंकि आपने जियोपॉलिटिक्स का जिक्र किया था, दिस इज़ वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग दैट इफ़ यू सी इट इन अ हिस्टोरिकल कॉन्टेक्स्ट, द इंडियन ओशन हैज़ बीन अ वेरी सिग्निफिकेंट जियोपॉलिटिकल ओशन ओवर द लास्ट 500 years. If you look at the history of the world, the first ocean that is punctuated in a very significant manner is the Indian Ocean, because at that time it was an Asian century, it was an Asian millennium. You look at China, you look at India, you look at the trade, so the Indian Ocean was a very significant geopolitical ocean. Subsequently, the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic become the equivalent of geopolitically significant. And finally, it's the Pacific when the United States comes into the global picture. So, in that sense, despite the history, despite the geography, India has been tenaciously sea blind. This is a term that I often use when I try to describe or talk about India and the Indian Ocean. And इसमें मैं दोबारा कहूँगा कि इसके जो कारण है ये ऐतिहासिक भी है, सांस्कृतिक भी है, यानी कि it is linked to your strategic culture. And historically, in the evolution of India, barring one or two dynasties, for instance, the Satavahanas in peninsular India in the BC period, the Cholas, very few other rulers of medieval India, ancient India, had what you might call as a comprehensive grasp of naval power and a comprehensive grasp of maritime power. They are different. Naval power is the hard power, the military power, and maritime power is the entirety of maritime commerce, maritime connectivity, and how do you use your ports and trade and so on. And India showed a certain ability in trade and commerce, in soft power. I mean, India's entire soft power of 1,000 years, you went to Southeast Asia, you went to China, you went to Japan, Buddhism traveled across the globe, etc., was because of connectivity. But we did not follow it up with what I would call as comprehensive sea power. And the ultimate price that we paid, and it's a complex subject, but संक्षेप में हम यही कह सकते हैं कि because of our sea blindness, India got colonized. Meaning, if you look at the period when the Portuguese came and then the British and the French and so on, भारत के उस वक्त जो भी सम्राट थे, चाहे वो मुगल थे या मराठा थे या किसी और जगह में, उनके पास उस प्रकार की सामरिक और जो समुद्री तट की जो क्षमताएं हैं वो उनके पास नहीं था. गन पाउडर, बंदूक, गन, उसका प्रयोग करना समुद्री तट पे उनको उस प्रकार का समझ नहीं था. और उसकी वजह से धीरे धीरे इंडियाज कॉलोनाइजेशन वाज enabled by what I would call as an inadequate appreciation of sea power and maritime power. And that is why it took almost 300 years from the time the Portuguese, the colonial period, till Indian independence for India to be aware of its maritime potential. And the last part of your question, abhi shayad dheere dheere, India is coming out of what I would call as its myopia about its maritime potential.
But sir, isn't this interesting? You just said that we were colonized because we were sea blind. But after independence also we continue to be sea blind.
I would say yes again, but that may be because of some historical reasons, which is that when India became independent in 1947, it was a very difficult security situation. First of all, you had an internal crisis because of partition, the displacement, millions of people had to be rehabilitated and so on. And then we had the first war for Kashmir, if you remember, 47-48. Progressively, India's strategic and security orientation became focused towards the land borders. सबसे पहले Pakistan, Kashmir, Kshetriya Akhandata, territorial sovereignty, all of that. And then we had a very rude kind of what you might call as national trauma, which was the October 1962 attack by China. So when that took place, I think Pandit Nehru as the Prime Minister and his entire security apex, the Cabinet Committee on Security, the political leadership, the military leadership, were all completely taken by surprise, as they say, and India had a terrible setback. Though in military terms, the Chinese withdrew after having made their point. We lost certain areas in terms of the claim that India had on contested territoriality. But what it did was, I think it left a deep scar on India's security thinking. And that scar was that we became, in a way, fixated on the land borders. So, therefore, we had limited resources. But most of the military budget was going towards the Army and the Air Force.
Right, sir.
And the Navy got the least amount. It's often called the Cinderella service. और उस वक्त का अगर आप तुलना देखेंगे, खास 1962 चीन के युद्ध के बाद, भारत का जो नौसेना का बजट जो था वो 9%, 10%, it became very, very small from a base of say 14, 15. It dropped to about 3, 4 and then went back. So even now, the Navy share of the budget is under 16 to 17% of the overall defense budget. The Army gets almost 60%. The Air Force gets about 20 to 24%. And the defense R&D gets the balance, and then the Navy. So we are really the smallest armed force in terms of budgetary allocation. The Navy is the smallest armed force in terms of personnel. अगर आप स्थल सेना, वायुसेना, नौसेना का जो पर्सनल स्ट्रेंथ है उसका आप तुलना करेंगे, the ratio is very skewed, as they say, meaning that it is almost 20:2:1. The Indian Army जो है, it's more than 1 million. It's 1.2 million almost. The Indian Air Force is more than 1 lakh. And the Indian Navy at one time was hovering around 60 to 70,000. So that will give you an idea about the personnel ratio, the budgetary allocation, and which is why बार बार हम नेवी को कहते हैं कि भाई ये सिंड्रेला सर्विस है, सबसे छोटा है, but it is strategically the most important.
Exactly.
Because it has a trans-border relevance. क्योंकि बार बार हम यही कहते हैं कि आप स्थल सेना को जितना भी बढ़ोतरी दीजिए, आप सीमा के उस पार ज़रूरत से ज़्यादा तो नहीं जा सकते हैं. You can't cross your border beyond a point. You can defend it. India is not an aggressive power. So ऐसा नहीं है कि हम आक्रमण करेंगे. But the Navy can go anywhere. You know, the Navy can move on to the Indian Ocean, it can move to the Atlantic Ocean, it can move to the South China Sea, it can go to the Pacific if there is a need and if we have the resources. तो इसलिए बार बार हमको इस चीज़ का ध्यान रखना चाहिए कि in terms of strategic relevance, जब हम सामरिक अहमियत की बात करते हैं, Indian Navy is, you know, by its very nature, it's a trans-border military capability. और आजकल आपके पास जिस प्रकार की आधुनिकता के जितने भी आपके पास सामग्री है, चाहे वो सैटेलाइट हो या साइबर हो या आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, इट एनेबल्स द इंडियन नेवी टू बी अ फार मोर इफेक्टिव ट्रांस बॉर्डर फोर्स. और आपका अंडर वाटर भी है, अभी तक हमने सबमरीन की बात ही नहीं की, पर दैट होल, यू नो, आई वुड से डोमेन अंडर वाटर, ऑन द सर्फेस ऑफ द वाटर एंड अबव द वाटर, विच इज़ द एंटायर मैरिटाइम continuum, has enormous potentialities, enormous opportunities, you know, both for naval power and for maritime power. You know, the last point, since I may forget this, आप जब cyber की बात करते हैं, today this is the information age. You know, the whole thing is information technology, cyber, spectrum, वगैरह वगैरह. The entire routing, most of it rather, is done by underwater cables. Today, our cyber connectivity is enabled globally by these huge numbers, vast miles, thousands of kilometers of cables that are going from one continent to the other, and in some places they are clustered. So those become critical nodes. So just as we talk about sea lines of communication for oil and for trade and so on, now you have underwater cables which are equally critical for the global economy, for global security, for global stability. It's a bit like telling your generation, what will you do if you don't have WhatsApp? You know, what will you do if your cell phone doesn't work? It will lead to global,
and anxiety,
you know,
global
anxiety,
insecurity.
insecurity. But that's what I mean by the maritime
then
domain.
Because if you look at it, we are always talking about the Third World War happening in the ocean, South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean being such a geopolitical turmoil right now, with the Red Sea in a crisis, and you know, everybody's trying to have their own bases. Somewhere India is not building its naval power at a faster pace than it should.
That's true. I think, you know, India should have invested far more in its
So is it a lack of strategic foresightedness, or is it something?
I would say it's a lack of political appreciation. Meaning, 1962 war is now more than 60 years old. Galwan has also happened. So India has to be concerned about China and what China is doing. The question that I often pose as an analyst is that could we have done it better in terms of dealing with our security challenges, whether it is a Pakistan or a China, by having a different kind of capability mix. At the moment, as I said, we are army-centric. If 55 to 60% of your budget goes towards the army, clearly that is your lead service. And there are many sort of reasons why the Indian Army has evolved the way it has. The Indian Air Force is the second largest armed force, and it also has budgetary constraints, but there is no doubt that air power is a very important element of modern military capability. But the Navy should have received, in my mind, greater attention, not only for the naval power, but the entire maritime power. Now, let me say this emphatically, ये बहुत दुख की बात है कि हम बार बार कहते हैं भाई ग्लोबलाइजेशन हो गया है, नरसिम्हा राव साहब के ज़माने से इंडिया हैज़ बीन liberalizing. India is now dependent on trade. Abhi Modi sahab aa gaye hain. We talk about India being the third largest economy in the world, वगैरह वगैरह. But Indian ports, if you look at them, India does not figure in the top 20 ports of the world.
We're trying to change that.
We're trying to change it, but we still haven't done it. It didn't need rocket science to say that we have to invest in our ports and make them more globally.
The lack of foresightedness then.
And lack of determination. That's why I keep saying that, it's a kind of mix of political resolve, political appreciation, and lack of professional bench strength. Now, the entire Indian ports and shipping sector should have been given much greater infusion of HR, human resource, perhaps greater incentive, and greater freedom to work in a global manner. So we have remained at the lower end of the food chain. What I mean by that is, मैं केवल इस वक्त maritime power की बात कर रहा हूँ. Shipping, ports, India and global commerce. अभी बार बार यही कहा जाता है that if you look at the global merchant fleet, India is one of the largest contributors. Indian seamen, Indian seafarers, along with countries like Philippines. We are supposed to be the number one, number two country in terms of number of people who are working in the global merchant marine. बार बार जब piracy होता है यही कहते हैं कि भाई उसमें Indian citizens were also there. But we are not at the top of the chain, meaning captains of ships, those who own shipping lines, those who are the big players. Today, the big players in the whole merchant fleet of the world is highly privatized, it's highly globalized. But most ships are registered in Panama because it's more convenient to register, or in Liberia. Most major global shipping owners outside of China, which is state-owned, are, say, for instance, in Germany, or they're in Greece, or they are consortiums in Europe, or in Japan, South Korea, which has a shipbuilding industry and a large footprint in that part of the maritime power domain. India has not risen up in those ranks. We are providing lower end, what I would call as people who are manning the ships, doing all the hard work. And that again is a lack of appreciation, a lack of political and I would say the entire ecosystem. Now slowly it is changing. Prime Minister Modi, after he came in his first term, उन्होंने सागर का जिक्र किया था. If you remember in 2015 जब वो पहली बार गए थे, वो द्वीपों का जो 3 island tour था, उन्होंने सागर का जिक्र किया. It's a very good concept. It talks about security and growth in the entire region, Indian Ocean region. पर तब से लेके आज तक हमने पूरा एक ऐसा ब्लूप्रिंट नहीं बनाया है जिससे मालदीव जैसा एक द्वीप है, श्रीलंका जो है, या और जैसे उस वक्त तो जब हमने शुरू किया था इट वाज श्रीलंका, मालदीव्स एंड इंडिया, सागर की बात हुई थी. पर अभी आप राजनीतिक जो संबंध है देखिए, मालदीव्स हैज गॉन अवे फ्रॉम इंडिया. द न्यू गवर्नमेंट इन मालदीव्स इज क्लोजर टू चाइना.
करेक्ट सर.
श्रीलंका के साथ हमारा काफ़ी तनाव हुआ था, हम्बन टोटा वगैरह जब राजपक्षे साहब थे. सो द जियोपॉलिटिक्स ऑफ इंडियाज सागर, to my mind, has not been adequately pursued with the broad objective that the maritime domain and the islands are very important for India. Therefore, we have to give it a much higher priority than what we are doing now.
Right, sir. तो सर सागर पॉलिसी पे आते हैं. तो सागर पॉलिसी, you just said that it was mentioned, was a great policy, but उसका reality में, in concrete terms, it is not very visual. For example, Seychelles की बात करते हैं. Seychelles has not allowed us to, have a cooperation on the port. Maldives has gone towards China. Sri Lanka, even though we have a better relation now after the economic crisis, but one cannot trust Sri Lanka right now. You have Bangladesh. You do not know what is going to happen with it. So somewhere or the other, the Sagar policy में growth of all in the region ठीक है. Security of all in the region is seen very suspiciously. And India is seen with a, कि bully का nature है, या what is its intentions in the waters. Somewhere that security word is, I think, misleading most of the countries in the region. Is that what your opinion is of this?
That's a great question, by the way. That if we talk about Sagar, growth for all in the region is a motherhood apple pie. I don't think anybody would dispute that all boats should rise together. And India has definitely enabled the growth for our neighbors, meaning आप श्रीलंका का उदाहरण लीजिए. जब से भारत और श्रीलंका के बीच में जो द्विपक्षीय ट्रेड वाला एग्रीमेंट हुआ था, तब से श्रीलंका हैज़ बेनिफिटेड कंसिडरेबली. If you look at Maldives, is a very small economy. Till their politics changed, Maldives was a very, I would say, major beneficiary of Indian support for its own growth. You could say the same thing about Bhutan, which is of course a land-based neighbor. So any small neighbor of India that has had a positive relationship has benefited for its own growth. But where the problem comes up is, जैसे आपने कहा, सिक्योरिटी का जब आप समीक्षा करेंगे या उसका आप बारीकी तरीके से देखेंगे, the arrival of China has in a way created problems for India in terms of its own security framework, because on one hand China has its own reasons for being in the Indian Ocean. Any major power, जैसे हमने पहले कहा था, अगर विश्व के 3 महासागर हैं, पैसिफिक ओशन, अटलांटिक ओशन, इंडियन ओशन, एक बुनियादी नीति है that any major power, if it wants to exude its own power, it has to be present or establish its maritime presence in 2 of the 3 navigable oceans of the world. आप 500 साल का इतिहास का समीक्षा कीजिए, जब से पोर्चुगीज विश्व में अपना मैरिटाइम पावर को उन्होंने प्रसिद्ध किया था. पोर्चुगल और स्पेन, उसको हम आइबेरियन पेनिनसुला कहते हैं. उसके बाद फ्रांस और ब्रिटेन. उस 500 साल के दरमियान में, यानी कि अमेरिका के आने तक, ये यूरोपियन जो देश थे, they used to ensure that they had credible military and maritime presence, दोनों military and maritime presence in 2 of the 3 navigable oceans of the world. कभी Atlantic Indian, कभी Atlantic Pacific when America came on the scene, but there was a imperative कि आप अपने maritime presence को अपने सीमाओं से बहुत दूर, you should be able to maintain it in a credible manner. तो हम विश्वसनीयता की बात कर रहे हैं. और चीन उसी प्रकार के खोज में, क्योंकि चीन का जो भूगोल है, चीन का जो पॉलिटिक्स है, वो बहुत ही उनके लिए नकारात्मक है. इट्स अ वेरी नेगेटिव ज्योग्राफी, मीनिंग इफ यू लुक एट अगेन, अगर आप चीन का जो मैप का कल्पना कर सकते हैं, द वेस्टर्न पैसिफिक, जो पश्चिमी पैसिफिक है, वो चीन का सीमा पे आता है. आप जापान से लेके नीचे आइए, जापान है, फिर साउथ कोरिया है, नॉर्थ कोरिया साउथ कोरिया है, फिर नीचे आएंगे तो ताइवान है, और फिर आसियान के देश आ जाते हैं. तो अर्थात ये मेनी ऑफ देम आर ऑल्सो अमेरिकन एलाइज. जैसे जापान इज एन एलाई, साउथ कोरिया के साथ उनका रिश्ता है, ताइवान है. सो चीन हैज़ अ वेरी डिफिकल्ट मैरिटाइम डोमेन. चाइना डज नॉट हैव द लग्जरी दैट अमेरिका हैज़ और इंडिया हैज़ कि आप अपने जहाज़ों को लेके, चाहे एयरक्राफ्ट कैरियर हो या पनडुब्बी हो, यू कैन गो स्ट्रेट इनटू द ओशन विदाउट एनी वन टू स्टॉप यू. China doesn't have that luxury. So China has realized, going back to the days of Mao Zedong, that if it has to be a credible Asian power in the first place, it has to be present in the Indian Ocean. Now, geography does not allow it to come into the Indian Ocean. So what has China done? I think to their credit, they have used their political and strategic, I would say, acumen, और उन्होंने political relationship बना दिया सबसे पहले पाकिस्तान के साथ, फिर धीरे धीरे बांग्लादेश के साथ, म्यांमार, बर्मा के साथ, श्रीलंका के साथ, अभी मालदीव्स के साथ, ईरान के साथ, जिबूती. So China has established political and military presence in and around the Indian Ocean. उससे भारत के लिए जो सामरिक और सिक्योरिटी, सुरक्षा के क्षेत्र में जो जटिलता है, जो कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी है, वो और बढ़ जाता है. And in that framework, for India, small islands have become bigger players in the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean. So if there was no China, a country like Maldives, a small island state, or for that matter Sri Lanka, would have automatically looked towards India, both for growth and security. But since China has come, और चाइना के पास भंडार है, भारत से कई गुना ज़्यादा पैसा है, उनका एक बहुत ही एम्बिशियस बेल्ट एंड रोड इनिशिएटिव है, सो दे हैव गिवन मच ग्रेटर इंसेंटिव. जैसे उन्होंने श्रीलंका में हम्बन टोटा किया था, और राजपक्षे साहब के पॉलिटिकल पार्टी और उनके परिवार के साथ उनके काफ़ी संबंध थे. सो द पॉलिटिक्स ऑफ श्रीलंका चेंज्ड. दे गेव देम हम्बन टोटा. हालांकि वो इतना सक्सेस तो नहीं रहा है. Similarly, in Maldives now with the new government, China has provided more incentive, more aid than what India was giving. So these smaller countries can play the China card. तो उसकी वजह से जो आप सवाल पूछ रही थी कि सिक्योरिटी में उस प्रकार का जो कोरिलेशन नहीं है, ग्रोथ तो हो जाता है, पर सिक्योरिटी में कई प्रकार के सस्पिशन और lack of confidence वगैरह हो जाता है. That is because of the way in which the major powers, and this is not new. If you look at India's own anxiety, एक ज़माना था जब हम कहते थे that America is supporting Pakistan against India, and therefore India had anxiety about American involvement in the region. Like that, I think in the maritime domain today, the China factor जो है भारत के लिए सुरक्षा और सामरिक दृष्टिकोण से यदि आप समीक्षा करेंगे या उसको देखेंगे, भारत के लिए कई प्रकार के जो ये जटिलताएं और जो इनसिक्योरिटी भारत के लिए पैदा हो जाता है। एक उदाहरण है, मान लीजिए चीन का रिसर्च शिप आ गया है रिसेंटली, इट वेंट टू श्रीलंका। नाउ जब भी श्रीलंका का
रिसर्च शिप और स्पाई शिप,
रिसर्च शिप कहते हैं, बट एक्चुअली इट इज आल्सो यूज्ड एज अ स्पाई शिप,
Yes.
बिकॉज एनी रिसर्च शिप टुडे हैज द काइंड ऑफ इक्विपमेंट दैट कैन बी यूज्ड फॉर स्पाइंग। बट ये बार बार ये स्पाई शिप की जब बात होती है, मोर देन लोगों के मन में ये भय पैदा हो गया कि वहाँ से इनके जो है ये भारत के कोस्टलैंड के ऊपर निगरानी करेंगे, ये पता लग जाएगा, वो पता लग जाएगा। दैट्स अ बिट आई थिंक ओवरस्टेटेड, क्योंकि हम आजकल इस प्रकार के ज़माने में हैं जहाँ जीपीएस के साथ अगर आप गाड़ी चला रहे हैं, आप सैटेलाइट से आपका कार का नंबर भी पकड़ सकते हैं। आपका सेल फोन के ऊपर अगर आप बात कर रहे हैं तो उसका भी सर्वेलेंस हो सकता है, यानी कि दैट काइंड ऑफ टेक्नोलॉजी इज अवेलेबल। बट द स्पाई शिप और द रिसर्च शिप हैज़ गॉट अ डिफरेंट काइंड ऑफ, टू माई माइंड, रेलेवेंस इन द इंडियन ओशन, कि आप जो अंडर वाटर हाइड्रोग्राफी होता है, जो सेलिनिटी है, जो कंडीशंस है, उसका आप मैपिंग कर सकते हैं, बिकॉज दैट बिकम्स वेरी रेलिवेंट फॉर सबमरीन ऑपरेशंस एंड एंटी सबमरीन वॉरफेयर। So that is the reason why when Chinese ships come, they are either trying to do some missile tracking. मान लीजिए भारत ने ऐलान किया है कि we'll do a ballistic missile test. So to track the missile, to track its flight path, you get a lot of information, technical information. उसी प्रकार से आप पनडुब्बी underwater operations के लिए you need a lot of data about the condition of the underwater domain throughout the year. यानी कि मानसून में अलग होता है, समर में अलग होता है, विंटर मंथ्स में अलग होता है। All this has a bearing on submarine operations and anti-submarine warfare. And because today India and China and the major powers are all invested in the nuclear submarine, जिसको हम SSBN कहते हैं, यानी कि the submarine that has got nuclear propulsion and carries a ballistic missile, which means well over 3,500 kilometers and has a nuclear tipped missile. That is a ballistic missile. So today a modern submarine which can be called an SSBN has this capability. United States has it, Russia has it, France has it, UK has it, so do China and India. Arihant that we talk about is India's SSBN. हालांकि हमारे मिसाइल के जो रेंज है अभी उस वर्ग पे नहीं है, but we are going there, we will get there. All of that means that the underwater domain in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, and you enter the Indian Ocean from the Pacific, मान लीजिए चीन की आप उदाहरण बात कर रहे हैं, around the entire sort of Indonesian archipelago. It doesn't come through the Malacca Straits. So there are various straits through which a submarine can come. Beyond that, there is Ombairwata. That is the kind of place where normally a submarine would operate from, especially if it is an SSBN. So this makes it complicated, the geography. So India has to be aware that Chinese research ships are perhaps doing all these activities as part of what they call as benign activities, which is why constantly India is a bit concerned about the presence of these ships.
Right, sir. Going back to string of pearls. Now, string of pearls is something that China is doing either through by building its own ports or through debt trap. And on the other hand, India's policies of string of diamonds or diamond necklace is through cooperation and, building soft power relations, like, for example, with Oman, with Mauritius. Now, why is it still that when we focus so much on soft power building, we are still not being able to get the kind of trust and support from the littoral countries of the region?
I have a slightly different assessment of this. Today, if you look at India in the Indian Ocean only, particularly over the last 6 months, largely because of, the war in Palestine, the Israel-Gaza war, and all the things that have happened after that, particularly the Houthi attack and the piracy from Somalia, etc., and India's own response. Today, India is seen as a credible security provider, very often the first security provider, and we saw some very, I would say, dramatic pictures of Indian marine commandos and the way they grappled down onto the ships and so on. But basically the point being that today in the region, if you look at the kind of observations, assessment, and the appreciation that has been accorded, India is definitely seen as the, as I said, first responder whenever there's a crisis, humanitarian, piracy, whatever. And also that India is more trusted than, for instance, China. Because today China has not shown any presence, nor has it come to the assistance of any ship, whether it's a merchant ship or any crew, whether they were stranded because of piracy or any other act. And China's own actions in the Southeast Asian region, particularly the South China Sea, you can see that China is not trusted as much. China is seen as a major economic power. China is seen as a country that could perhaps replace the United States 10 years from now. So there is a certain awareness of China. But in terms of the maritime domain in the Indian Ocean, today I think India's credibility and trust is at a higher level than what China has. And China may have its own reasons why it does not want to come and be a security provider in the Indian Ocean. There could be logistic reasons, there could be other reasons. And in the politics of Southeast Asia, because of the claim that China is making in the South China Sea, you know the kind of crisis now tension between चाइना एंड फिलीपींस पिछले 2-3 महीनों से वहाँ का जो तनाव है वो बढ़ रहा है और उनका लो लेवल क्लैश बार बार चलता है. उनके कोस्ट गार्ड भी आ जाता है, प्राइवेट मिलिशिया आ जाता है, दे आर बम्पिंग द फिलीपीन शिप्स एंड थ्रेटनिंग टू यूज वाटर कैनन्स. तरह तरह का वहाँ पे एक प्रकार का छोटा गलवान हो रहा है वहाँ पे, you know, in terms of how China is pursuing its territorial agenda in the South China Sea, which itself is actually not a valid proposition, but they have created artificial islands and now they are staking their claim and using the historical legacy issues, etc., etc. So I'm coming back to this point that I think in the overall assessment, currently India's credibility and India's trust is of a higher order, but India needs to do a lot more, meaning the politics of Maldives, the politics of Sri Lanka, are a good example of how you have to have a composite relationship where politics, diplomacy, economic, trade support, and military are all melded in such a way that the bilateral relationship shows that level of trust and confidence.
So, last question on this. What went wrong with the Maldives issue?
Well, clearly the domestic politics, meaning that you have two parties, and I think China saw an opening. Because I think, again, this is my personal opinion, I think India dropped the ball. Meaning that for a country that knew that Maldives was as important as it is, we perhaps could have been more aware and abreast of the domestic politics and engaged with the political leadership in such a way that things did not come to this pass.
Are we doing the same mistake with Kachativu?
Well, Kachativu, again, my personal view, I think it has become an electoral issue related to Tamil Nadu. Otherwise, again, my reading is that, you know, raking up an issue that had been more or less resolved satisfactorily in 1974 by a previous government and bringing it right into center stage because you think you might get electoral advantage in the state of Tamil Nadu, to my mind, is not a very prudent or a sagacious
from the foreign policy
decision.
perspective.
And from the security perspective. Right. Because if you want to build your bilateral with a country like Sri Lanka, now, it again affects your credibility. You know, tomorrow Bangladesh might say that India would go back on the enclaves agreement. That possibility exists. Similarly, you know, in the global arena, I think for a major power like India, you can't revisit, to my mind, past agreements. You know, whether we talk about commercial agreements, political agreements, or any of these, you know, that affects the credibility of the state, I think.
Heads up. So let's move to the Red Sea crisis. So there was always piracy attacks in these waters. But it has escalated with the attacks by the Houthis also in this region. Do you think it is somewhere linked or it has just escalated because they have seen an opportunity that this is the right time for, you know, exploiting the crisis?
You know, regarding the Houthis and the Red Sea crisis, I think it will be fair to say that, yes, they are linked. Now, we are almost into 6 months of the Israeli war on Gaza. It started on October 7th when Hamas attacked Israel, and then you had the Israeli war of retribution or reprisal, which has gone beyond any level of proportionality. I personally think that this is unprecedented and history will judge all of us for having been more or less silent when this atrocity, which is verging on genocide, has happened. And I think till the Houthis stepped up their own attacks, the global community was not even willing to acknowledge that Israel was acting in this manner in Gaza. I mean, this is a sad thing to say, but barring some ineffective resolutions in the United Nations Security Council, the global community was more or less comatose when it came to what was happening in
Still is.
Israel Gaza. परंतु जब से हौथी ने अपना आक्रमण किया था, खास उन जहाज़ों के ऊपर जिनके इजरायली लिंक था, suddenly the global community became aware, and because the ambit of the footprint extended and more merchant ships were getting affected, and then they talked about going around the Horn of Africa वगैरह, रेड सी जो क्षेत्र है वो सामरिक दृष्टिकोण से ज़्यादा अहम हो गया था. इट्स सेलियंस और रेलेवेंस इंक्रीज्ड बट इन अ नेगेटिव वे. एंड आई थिंक कंकरेंटली पायरेसी भी बढ़ गया था. जब भारतीय नौसेना ने अपना फर्स्ट रिस्पॉन्स किया था, वी वर वेरी क्लियर टू से दैट वी आर प्रोवाइडिंग असिस्टेंस टू शिप्स दैट वर अटैक्ड बाय पायरेट्स. हम ये जियोपॉलिटिक्स में ज़्यादा नहीं पढ़ना चाहते थे हौथी के बारे में, क्या ये सही है सही नहीं है. इसलिए वी डिड नॉट एंगेज इन एनी टास्क फोर्स और एनी एक्टिविटी दैट वाज सीन टू बी एंटी हौथी. दैट वाज बीइंग डन बाय द अमेरिकन्स, बाय द रॉयल नेवी वगैरह. इवन यूरोपियन नेवीज वो काफ़ी हिचक रहे थे. बट द रियलिटी इज दैट बिकॉज ऑफ द हौथीज एंड व्हाट दे डिड, द रेड सी हैज़ बिकम मोर एनिमेटेड, more volatile. Concurrently, piracy also happened. So I think it has drawn attention to how fragile the global supply chain is. And the use of drones has also introduced a new element in terms of the threat at sea. पहले तो जब हम maritime domain की बात करते थे, केवल वॉरशिप, पनडुब्बी, एयरक्राफ्ट इस प्रकार के प्रयोग करते थे. अभी ये ड्रोन का जो प्रयोग सबसे पहले यूक्रेन वॉर में, रशिया यूक्रेन में, उसके बाद यहाँ पे अभी शायद एक नया प्लेटफॉर्म है, एक नई जानकारी आई है दैट यू ऑल्सो हैव टू डिफेंड योर सेल्फ वेदर इट्स योर मर्चेंट शिप और योर वॉरशिप अगेंस्ट द पॉसिबिलिटी ऑफ ड्रोन अटैक. तो मेरे ख्याल से ये एक नया पन्ना है जब हम मैरीटाइम सिक्योरिटी की बात करते हैं. How will the drone be used, the unmanned drone, the drone with surveillance, the drone with ordnance, and how this will impact naval warfare is going to be, or even maritime security will be a very important area for study.
So piracy is a non-state actor threat, right? And to deal with it, it cannot just be, stopping piracy and bringing back the pirates, and it needs to go back to solving the crisis in Somalia. But countries are not. Actually, there's no global action on it. Piracy is just increasing, and somewhere or the other, this is now becoming कि pirate attacks हो रहा है. हमेशा से था, sir. I'm sure you would also be when you were visiting.
Piracy is thousands of years old.
Right. It's always been there. But why is it suddenly coming into news and it is becoming a matter of concern? That's where my point is. That is it all coming down to the point that because of so much of presence of the US and other countries, like there are 3 operations going on simultaneously in these waters. Is it all because of the global forces right now in these waters, or is it just that, it's an opportunity for the non-state actors to take in, especially African non-state actors to come in?
सबसे पहले जो आपने बात किया था पायरेसी के बारे में, मुझे याद आ रहा है कि इट्स वेरी ओल्ड, प्राचीन है. अगर आप सिंदबाद द सेलर की बात करें, कहानी, वो जो लुटेरे कहते थे, सो आई थिंक इन द हिस्टोरिकल मेमोरी, piracy in the Indian Ocean, piracy in the Mediterranean, Vikings, वगैरह, it's a very old kind of a practice at sea. How do we deal with it? And I think that is where in the modern period, there is now an international law, a canon, that piracy is completely outlawed. So it's a criminal act. A navy or any ship can take action as it deems appropriate based on its own laws. Recently, India has enacted its anti-piracy bill. So that gives you a legal framework. But the reason why I think your question about suddenly there are so many major forces, particularly in this part of the world, I think historically, major forces came into the Indian Ocean after 1979, when you had a series of multiple geopolitical and major energy-related events. One was the oil hike,
right, sir,
which happened in 73, 76, and then when Iran, and you had the hostage crisis with the United States. That was the first time that the United States suddenly became aware of its own security interests in this region. And President Jimmy Carter was then in office. You saw that the US suddenly started looking at the Indian Ocean and the North Arabian Sea in a completely different way. उसी साल 1979 में आपको याद होगा, you had the overthrow of the Shah of Iran that led to the crisis. Then concurrently towards the end of that year, you had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And around in that year itself, you had the first attack on Makkah, what you call now as jihadi terrorism. There was what you might call as the use of the religious element in non-state entities. You know, whether it is the Kalashnikov, whether it is the Al-Qaeda and the kind of things that we became more familiar with later, Osama bin Laden, वगैरह वगैरह. The beginning was the siege of the Holy Mosque and how, you know, they had to use various means to ensure that. So there were three factors that came in 1979 that in a way enhanced the geopolitical relevance of the Indian Ocean. After 1979 and the Cold War ended, we had the piracy attack in 2007. And that is after a 25-year period, almost 25-year period. China found an opening to come into the Indian Ocean.
Right, sir.
उस साल से पहले, यानी कि ये जो एंटी पायरेसी ऑपरेशन से पहले चीन का जो नेवी है, पीएलए नेवी, वो कभी इंडियन ओशन के अंदर नहीं आया था इन दिस वे. Once they got the opening, they entered from the Straits of Malacca and it was a big thing for them. 500 साल के बाद चीन का एक जहाज वापस हिंद महासागर में आया था और तब से वापस नहीं गए. That is the big thing. That from the first anti-piracy operation of 2008, 3 जहाज आए थे, तब से लेके आज तक 16 साल हो गए हैं. Now China has maintained a more or less permanent presence in the Indian Ocean as part of anti-piracy. और उन्होंने अपना जो supply and जो भी रिपेयर के लिए वेस्ट कोस्ट ऑफ अफ्रीका में और गल्फ में उन्होंने अपना जगह बनाया है. So Pakistan, UAE and along the east coast of Africa and as you said Djibouti are all now places. Yeah, so the major power interest in the Indian Ocean is increasing. First to the US, which has got its own island in Diego Garcia. It has got a fleet in Bahrain. It has got naval presence, you know, in various parts of the Indian Ocean. It has allies, it has partners. India is a partner. And China has also come on board. So I foresee that there will be a lot of naval and maritime activity between these three powers, which is India as the resident power, United States and China as the non-resident powers, and the European Union, maybe France could also play a role because they have an island by the way. उनके पास Reunion Island है. So I think we are coming back to what we started the discussion saying कि 500 साल पहले Indian Ocean was a geopolitically very relevant ocean. 3000 साल पहले भी था, 500 साल पहले भी था because of the European, you know, kind of military competition over the Indian Ocean. And now in 2025 onwards or 2024 onwards, I expect चाहे Quad हो या किसी और जो framework है, one expects that the geopolitical relevance, अहमियत जो है वो बढ़ जाएगा. इसलिए मैं दोबारा वही बात पे आऊँगा कि भाई भारत के जो नौसेना है और भारत की जो संपूर्ण मैरीटाइम पावर है उसको ऊपर ध्यान देना, उसके लिए रिसोर्सेज देना और एक दृढ़ता होना चाहिए. वो अभी तक मेरे ख्याल से भारत के सामरिक जो रेडार पे उस प्रकार से क्लैरिटी से नहीं आया है जितना मैं समझता हूँ होना चाहिए, ताकि आपकी ये जो सी ब्लाइंडनेस की जो हम बात कर रहे थे वो धीरे धीरे हट जाए. और ये मेरा एक स्टैंडर्ड सजेशन था जब मैं स्कूल जाता हूँ, कॉलेज जाता हूँ, लेक्चर करता हूँ, कि जब आप भारत का मैप देखते हैं, टर्न इट अपसाइड डाउन. जब भी आप भारत का मैप देखते हैं, हिमालय ऊपर आ जाता है और पेनिनसुलर इंडिया नीचे दक्षिणी तरफ होता है और श्रीलंका का द्वीप छोटा और मैप खत्म हो जाता है. हमारे कल्पना में अंटार्कटिका तो है ही नहीं. हम सोचते भी नहीं हैं कि अगर आप भारत के हिंद महासागर से और दक्षिणी ओर जाएंगे तो अंटार्कटिका है. दैट इज़ द न्यू गेम, आर्कटिक एंड अंटार्कटिक. इसलिए अगर एक सजेशन है, अगर आप स्कूल, इंस्टीट्यूट, कॉलेज, यूनिवर्सिटी के साथ जुड़े हुए हैं, एक आध मैप को उल्टा करिए ताकि आजकल के बच्चों को अपने कल्पना में ये ध्यान तो आए कि भारत की मैरीटाइम पोटेंशियल क्या है. किसी और देश के पास इस प्रकार की मैरीटाइम पोटेंशियल, हमारे एशिया के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में मैं कह रहा हूँ, नहीं है और उसका हमें फ़ायदा लेना चाहिए, लाभ लेना चाहिए. और इसकी एनवायरमेंटल बात तो हमने किया ही नहीं. द इंडियन ओशन इज़ क्रिटिकल फॉर क्लाइमेट चेंज, एनवायरमेंटल डेग्रेडेशन, ह्यूमन सिक्योरिटी, और उसके ऊपर तो हम ध्यान ही नहीं करते हैं. अभी एक ज़माना था जब हम कहते थे कि भारत में गाय जो है वो प्लास्टिक खाते हैं क्योंकि उनके पास और चारा नहीं है. इसी प्रकार से now fish in the Indian Ocean are also eating plastic.
Microplastics have been found. Yes.
So this is the kind of pollution and these are all issues which impact human security. अंत में आप जितना भी जियोपॉलिटिक्स की बात कीजिए, ह्यूमन सिक्योरिटी जो है वो सबसे अहम है. आप चाणक्य पढ़िए, अर्थशास्त्र पढ़िए, वो यही कहते थे कि अंत में जो सम्राट की जो दायित्व है, उस ज़माने में सम्राट थे, एम्परर. अभी ज़माना बदल गया, हम लोकतांत्रिक देश हैं, तो वी हैव अ डेमोक्रेसी. सो वी डोंट हैव रूलर्स. ये बार बार लोग रूलर कहते हैं, भाई कोई रूलर नहीं है. वी हैव पीपल वी इलेक्ट टू गवर्न अस, नॉट टू रूल अस. और उस गवर्नेंस में जो दायित्व है, जो जिम्मेदारी है, वो ह्यूमन सिक्योरिटी है. और वो ह्यूमन सिक्योरिटी आपके हिंद महासागर के साथ बहुत ही बारीकी और बहुत ही जटिल तरीके के साथ जुड़ा हुआ है. एक मोटा उदाहरण ये है कि इस वक्त क्लाइमेट चेंज का जो हम बार बार कहते हैं, इफ़ द टेम्परेचर पैटर्न ऑफ द इंडियन ओशन का जो सरफेस होता है, अगर वो बदल जाता है, योर मानसून इज अफेक्टेड. और आपका मानसून सही नहीं होगा तो यू कैन इमेजिन क्या होगा पूरा साउथ एशिया में, चाहे बांग्लादेश हो, भारत हो, पाकिस्तान हो. द होल रीजन विल बी ड्राउट एंड नो रेन, नो मॉइस्चर, एंड इट विल हैव अ ह्यूज इम्पैक्ट. तो आपका माइग्रेशन शुरू हो जाएगा, रेफ्यूजीज हो जाएंगे. सो आई एम सेइंग, जब संपूर्ण सुरक्षा की हम बात करते हैं, एवरीथिंग इज कनेक्टेड. फ्रॉम द स्मॉलेस्ट फिश, द प्लैंक्टन, द कोरल, pollution, plastic, all of that is linked to land, human beings, human security, geopolitics, etc., etc. So we should have that understanding about the maritime domain.
That's a very comprehensive, looking from the smallest to the largest. But the problem is that countries are still fascinated by the naval power rather than the maritime. Even though there are conversations, sir, on, I think, blue economy and the shipping agreements and everything, but still the fascination remains on having nuclear submarines in the Indian Ocean. And I'm going to come back to that only. I'm going to come back to the geopolitics. Do you think that the Third World War is going to happen in South China Sea?
That's a real googly. Do I think the Third World War will start in the maritime domain and particularly in the South China Sea? As an analyst, I can only give you a tentative, cautious answer saying the probability is high. Because if there is a world war today, it will have to involve the major powers.
Right, sir.
And currently, if you look at who are the major powers who have an adversarial or a relationship that is not friendly, partnership, cordial, etc., immediately what comes to mind is United States, Russia on one hand, and United States, China also, which is moving in that direction, but in a different manner. My sense is that Russia is unlikely to wage a war with the United States in the South China Sea. Okay. They may have another area, maybe Ukraine, maybe Europe, we don't know which way it's going. Now, once in a while, President Putin has drawn attention to his own nuclear weapons. Will that trigger a major war? It's a question mark. I personally hope not. And I also think not, that President Putin may not really, go in that direction. But on the other hand, I think the potential for a US-China conflict over Taiwan is relatively high. Much would depend on the next US president. Will it be Mr. Donald Trump? If so, will he act in a manner that would heighten the tension? Or is it possible that the United States and China would be able to arrive at a modus vivendi, which is what the last conversation between President Biden and President Xi Jinping seemed to suggest. If you see in the last week, they have had a conversation, and now the two militaries are again meeting, and the US Commerce Secretary has gone to China, etc., etc. हो सकता है कि उन दोनों के बीच में फिर एक प्रकार का समझौता हो. परंतु ताइवान का जो मुद्दा है, अगर किसी प्रकार से, the term we use, if the balloon goes up, if China acts in an aggressive way for its own reasons, we don't know why, but suppose China decides that they will actually take the first step and militarily try to take over Taiwan, I think then the situation can escalate. And will it lead to a world war, meaning that Japan would have to be drawn in by alliance requirements?
Even South Korea.
South Korea. So these two are military allies of the United States. So you can see the footprint is increasing. On China's side, will North Korea help China? Will Russia help China? If Russia and China are on the same side, in a military conflict which has the United States and its allies on the other side, then we are moving towards the world war that we are talking about. And then the real, I think, geopolitical question is, where will India be?
Exactly, sir. Where would India be?
Yeah, I think it will be a very difficult decision for India, because we also have to see what will be the implications. We are just now seeing what are the consequences of a limited war in Ukraine. It's limited in geography, it's limited in terms of the principal interlocutors or players. We are seeing a war in Gaza, which is very different from Ukraine, but we know what are the consequences. अगर अभी अब अफगानिस्तान की तो हमने बात ही नहीं किया है, 20 साल वहाँ पे जंग चल रहा था, we know where Afghanistan is. So I think India would have to take a very calibrated judicious position. Can it be a peacemaker? Can it ensure that the hostilities are? What kind of a role will it play? I think it's a tough question to answer, but it cannot be an impulsive decision.
So in this light, so we have decided not to make Quad a security or a military alliance. We have also decided to have alliances with US, keeping in mind that there is a probability of a war. So, we are trying to balance, or in the current geopolitical terms, finding strategic autonomy. In that light, should we modernize our military? Should we get the third aircraft carrier then?
I just want to add one little clarification, not clarification, but one more observation. India traditionally has remained far away from military alliances. So even with the United States, we have repeatedly said that we are willing to enter into very strong partnerships in a variety of areas. खास टेक्नोलॉजी के क्षेत्र में हम बार बार चाहते हैं कि हम स्ट्रेटेजिक कोऑपरेशन, स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनरशिप को और बढ़ोतरी दें. परंतु ये जो शब्दकोश है मिलिट्री अलायंस, वो भारत के लिए इस वक्त हम हिचकते हैं. वी डोंट वांट टू गेट इनटू इट. चाहे आप नॉन अलाइनमेंट की बात करें या स्ट्रेटेजिक ऑटोनॉमी की बात करें, वी वुड लाइक टू बी एन इंडिपेंडेंट काइंड ऑफ प्लेयर. But that does not mean that we will not engage with a country like, चाहे रूस के साथ हमारा बहुत ही खास संबंध था मिलिट्री इन्वेंट्री के लिए, but we spoke about a friendship treaty, special partnership. We were never a military ally of Soviet Union. I think that kind of position will stay for India. But in the current context, I think, for India, the aircraft carrier military modernization, to my mind, is imperative. We have to modernize the Indian military, especially when warfare is moving, towards new directions, cyber, spectrum, AI. Technology का इतना परिवर्तन हो गया है when we talk about the military domain. The drone is only one very basic example what the drone has done to warfare. New technologies, new innovations are going to change it. So therefore, I think the short answer for military modernization, yes, we must. Regarding aircraft carrier, my response as an analyst is, I don't know if we have time to go into the details, but my summary is that if India can afford it, we must invest in aircraft carriers, and we must also invest in nuclear powered aircraft carriers, just as we have invested in nuclear powered submarines. That is the direction of the future. If you want to be the world's third largest economy with aspirations कि अगर आप number 3 हैं, तो maybe you want to become number 2 and then number 1. साथ साथ आपका जो सैनिक क्षमता है, जो सामरिक रीच है, वो ट्रांस बॉर्डर की जो हमने बात किया था, सीमा पार जो आपकी क्षमताएं हैं, the aircraft carrier is one piece in that puzzle. With the conventional aircraft carrier, by and large, you will be in the Indian Ocean. You may not even be able to deploy in Southeast Asia. I'm not saying India has to become a player in the South China Sea dispute. But if you want to be a global power, just as the United States is now able to establish a presence in the Indian Ocean, I expect that if you want to be a major power, you should be able to establish your presence in the Pacific Ocean. Where in the Pacific Ocean is a geopolitical choice. चाहे आप जापान के पास रहेंगे या उस एरिया में, या यहाँ पे इंडोनेशिया के पास रहेंगे, या बिल्कुल पैसिफिक ओशन के बीच में जाएंगे हवाई की तरफ. These are all geopolitical choices. Where are you expected to be? Where does your national interest demand that you maintain a naval presence in one part of the global maritime domain? But you must have the capability. And that's what a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier will give you, to project power, to project presence, to establish presence and to project power. That's how I would phrase it.
Right, sir. Sir, the last question for today. What is the strategic significance of INS Jatayu? That's, we are focusing so much on Lakshadweep and Andaman Nicobar Islands. So, INS Jatayu.
Well, at the moment, I would say that it is a signal, as far as the region is concerned. that India is going to invest in the Lakshadweep mini COI. Till now, we only had the Andaman Nicobar chain, which is in the Bay of Bengal. L&M, as it is called, Lakshadweep and mini COI, was relatively, I would say, left without much of a naval or any kind of military presence. There were various reasons for it. The topography there does not allow the kind of investment that we have as far as A&N, Andaman Nicobar, is concerned. Even the area is much, much smaller in L&M. The total area of the Lakshadweep Minico Islands, they're all, literally tiny. But we felt it necessary because of the geopolitical developments in the Indian Ocean. That's how I would interpret it. India decided that whether it's because of Maldives, whether it's because of Djibouti, that to have a surveillance kind of capability located in those islands would be desirable. We may step up, but much would depend on the geopolitics and what is it that the L&M islands can sustain, in terms of their topography. Is it enough to have just a surveillance without getting into jetties and creating assets? Like in the A&N, we have assets. We have a whole command, a tri-service command. And there are different assets in the Andaman part and there are different assets in the Nicobar part. So like that, I think we'll have to take a decision progressively. What are the drivers? What are the assets we need in the L&M? And accordingly, I think we will increase our presence because of, as I said, islands are now becoming strategically more relevant in the overall maritime picture.
Sir, last question. In the current scenario, is India a regional Indian Ocean player or is it a major player in the...
In the Indian Ocean context, India is the major player. There's no doubt about it. That's also because of geography. Because whether it is for the United States or China, which are the other major powers who have the capability, because today, as you know, China has the largest number of warships, they can maintain a presence. But geography does not allow them to maintain it in the way that India can. They can do it if they decide, but they'll have to invest a lot of resources. I mean, when the Afghan war was going on, you had a lot of American presence, both merchant and otherwise. But India is the de facto natural Indian Ocean power. China is trying to, in a way, also make its presence felt. But my reading is that in the immediate future, unless the whole geopolitics of the Indian Ocean changes, China would find it more difficult to maintain the kind of presence that India can naturally do.
Right, sir. चलिए इसी के साथ आज का पॉडकास्ट भी खत्म करते हैं. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me today, and thank you to all the viewers for joining me in this geopolitical dialogues with Bhaskar sir.
Thank you. StudyIQ IAS. अब तैयारी हुई अफोर्डेबल.